From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan. I'm here with Ralph Nader. Make sure to pick up Ralph's latest book, Return to Sender, Unanswered Letters to the President 2003-2014. You can get it at anywhere fine books are sold. David Feldman is still recovering from the flu. We wish him the best. Later in the show, we're going to be talking to a distinguished author and journalist, William Blum, one of the foremost critics of U.S. foreign policy. Knows a lot about those rascals over at the CIA. And if we have time at the end of the show, we'll try to work our way through more of your Facebook questions. But to start, very excited to have this gentleman on our show, George Farah. George Farah is an antitrust attorney, as well as the founder and executive director of Open Debates. He is the author of the book, No Debate, How the Republican and Democratic Parties Secretly Control the Presidential Debates. That comes to you by 7 Stories Press. His articles have been published in the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Denver Post, Christian Science Monitor, Fort Lauderdale Sun-Sentinel, Extra Magazine, and many other publications. Mr. Farah has also appeared on dozens of television programs, including Nightline, Now with Bill Moyers, 2020, CBS Evening News, and the NBC Nightly News. We are delighted to have him with us. Welcome, George Farah.
Thank you so much for having me, Steve.
Yes, and welcome again, George. George and I go back a long way, and before he wrote his groundbreaking book, it was published in 2004, and it's called No Debate, How the Republican and Democratic Parties Secretly Control the Presidential Debates. Before that, there was almost nothing written on the presidential debates other than, that they occur, and here are the candidates, and this is where the location is going to be. And so to get started, George, the reason why I think it's important to look at the history here is because the Commission on Presidential Debates is a brilliant innovation to restrict the voices of the people and restrict the choices that they have of candidates by having the two parties control the presidential debate process. So why don't you just start with, how did this debate commission come about? It has an official sounding name, but you went into the raw documents in writing your book, No Debate. How did it all come about? And then we'll talk about the contemporary scene.
Sure. So prior to the Commission on Presidential Debates, the League of Women Voters, a genuinely nonpartisan organization committed to championing democracy, ran the presidential debates, our most important public forums. And they ran the presidential debates from 1976 until 1984 and did a fantastic job. Whenever the major party candidates tried to manipulate these sacred forums, the League of Women Voters called them out and fought back as representatives of the people. For example, in 1980, John B. Anderson, a congressman from Illinois, ran an independent campaign for the presidency. The vast majority of voters wanted to see him in the presidential debates, but President Carter refused to debate him. The League said, you know what? So what? We're going to go forward and host a presidential debate. And they had a debate between John B. Anderson and Republican nominee Ronald Reagan that attracted 55 million viewers. It was moderated by Bill Moyers. 4 years later, the Republican and Democratic parties tried to manipulate the formats. They vetoed 68 of the moderators that the League of Women Voters had proposed for the presidential debates. The League had enough. They issued a press release accusing the candidates of trying to abuse the process. They called them out. They attacked them for trying to undermine democracy, and the response was that the campaigns apologized and ultimately accepted the League's proposed moderators. And finally, in 1988, the major party candidates got together for the first time in history behind closed doors and negotiated a secret document called a Memorandum of Understanding that dictates how the debates will be structured, who will participate, how high the podiums will be, and all sorts of other details. They handed this document to the League of Women Voters, and the League said, "Are you kidding me?" They held a press conference, and they accused the campaigns of, quote, perpetrating a fraud on the American voter, end quote. And they said they refused to be an accessory to the hoodwinking of the American people. So the League was the champion of the democratic process with respect to the presidential debates. They were our voice, meaning the people's voice in the room fighting back against the candidates' manipulation. The major parties got sick and tired of a women's organization telling their candidates who could participate in these debates and under what conditions. They didn't like this at all. So in 1986, the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee ratified an agreement for the parties to take over the presidential debates. They incorporated the commission in 1987, and their chairs, the chairs of the RNC and the DNC, Frank Fahrenkopf and Paul Kirk, went on to co-chair the Commission on Presidential Debates for the next 25 years.
Which is a private corporation, right? It's not an official body.
It has no affiliation with the federal government. It gets no funding from the federal government. It was not in any way created by any sort of statute. It's a private corporation that was incorporated by private individuals and the Democratic and Republican parties. It's financed primarily by corporate contributions. It's co-chaired by private individuals, both of whom, by the way, are corporate lobbyists. And it functions in the exact opposite manner that the League of Women Voters did. In other words, its interests are serving the wishes of the Republican and Democratic nominees at the expense of what voters actually want, rather than fighting on behalf of voters to resist the manipulations of the Republican and Democratic nominees.
Name some of the corporations who have funded the Commission on Presidential Debates over the years.
First of all, the biggest contributor to the commission is Anheuser-Busch, the
a beer company.
A beer company. And
what do you think of that, Steve? You can't make this up, huh?
I think you have to be drunk to believe that.
When I asked Frank Fahrenkopf, actually, I was in his office, and I was interviewing him, and I said, Frank, what do you think about having beer companies and tobacco companies, by the way, sponsoring our presidential debates? He looked at me and he said, boy, you're asking the wrong guy. I represent the gambling industry. Frank Fahrenkopf was the CEO of the American Gaming Association until he retired in 2013. So Anheuser-Busch has given millions of dollars to the Commission on Presidential Debates. And when you go to the debate sites, they've kind of turned them into corporate carnivals where you have scantily clad Anheuser-Busch girls passing out pamphlets denouncing beer taxes. It's really a disgrace. Other companies that have given money to the Commission on Presidential Debates include Philip Morris, Sheldon Cohen, a private law firm, the International Bottled Water Association, various airlines, Philips Electronics. That's just a litany of corporations. Ford Motor Company gave some money. Philip Morris actually gave $250,000 just for the privilege of hanging a banner in the debate room. American Airlines has given money. AT&T has given money. I mean, it's a litany of Fortune 500 companies with regulatory interests before Congress. What I think is really fascinating, Ralph, is that when the League of Women Voters used to host these events, they scrambled to raise money. Nancy Newman, the executive director of the League of Women Voters at the time, said she'd be lucky to get a $5,000 contribution to host these presidential debates watched by 70 to 80 million viewers. But the Commission on Presidential Debates gets millions of dollars in contributions. And the reason is because they realize it's a form of a political contribution. They get to hit two birds with one stone. By giving to the Commission on Presidential Debates, they're able to publicly support both major parties, keep out third-party voices that may be critical of corporate power, and at the same time get a tax deduction to boot. So it's a very, very attractive political contribution. Not to mention they get access at the debate sites with tickets to these events and rubbing shoulders with the various aides for the Republican and Democratic nominees who are also at the debate sites.
And most of the people really don't know the history of it. They hear the phrase Commission on Presidential Debates and think it's an official body, and they don't really know what the procedures are that exclude other candidates for president, regardless of the national polls, other than the Democratic Republican candidates. And so do you want to describe some of the absurdly high hurdles that third-party candidates, including myself, by the way, would have to surmount the rules of the Commission on Presidential Debates to get on the debate?
Sure. The history of this is actually very fascinating. For a long time, the Commission had this amorphous list of criteria, how much attention you were getting in the press, or whether or not a lot of substantial articles were being written about you, a multiple-page description of some sort of amorphous indicator that would allow them to exclude anybody. And this is how they justified the exclusion of Ross Perot, for example, in 1996. Ross Perot was excluded from that presidential debate despite the fact that he had $29 million in taxpayer funds. 76% of the public wanted him included. He had won the 1992 presidential debates 4 years earlier, but this time the Republican Democratic nominees wanted him out. And so he was kept out, and these criteria were just used as an excuse to say, hey, he's not significant enough. The negotiations behind that, Ralph, by the way, are absolutely fascinating. Let's take a quick second just to describe them. This just explains how manipulated these debates actually are. In 1996, Republican nominee Bob Dole was running on the Republican ticket, and Bill Clinton was running on the Democratic ticket. And Bob Dole desperately wanted to keep Ross Perot out of the debates. He knew that Ross Perot would take more votes away from him. Clinton was winning in the polls. He was winning by 15 or 20 points. He didn't want anyone to watch these events. He didn't want anyone watching the debates. So Bill Clinton struck a deal with Bob Dole. They agreed to exclude Ross Perot to protect Bob Dole on the condition that Dole agreed to eliminate follow-up questions in the debates, cancel one debate, and schedule the remaining 2 debates opposite the World Series. So viewers at home were hoping to see Ross Perot, were hoping to see 3 exciting debates. Instead, they got no Ross Perot. There were no follow-up questions to challenge the candidates' assertions, and the debates were held against the World Series, attracting the lowest viewership in the history of presidential debates.
George, tell our listeners whether the press covered what you just said.
Absolutely not, because the Commission on Presidential Debates made an announcement saying Ross Perot failed to meet our criteria, and the press believed the commission was a genuine, nonpartisan organization with some sort of official title. In fact, they conducted a poll afterwards. Who do you blame for Ross Perot's exclusion? 5% blame Bill Clinton, 13% blame Bob Dole, 50% blame the Commission on Presidential Debates. So the candidates were able to avoid public accountability for their manipulations of the exclusion of a third-party candidate by hiding behind this private commission with an official-sounding name. It's an outrage. In the last 4 election cycles, as a result of criticism of these amorphous criteria, the commission adopted a new standard, Ralph. 15%. Third-party candidates need to reach 15% in pre-debate polls to be invited to the presidential debates. This is an absurdly high figure. It doesn't really make any sense. First of all, if you're trying to figure out who ought to be included in presidential debates, why not just ask the American people? Who do you want included in the presidential debates? It's not a complicated question. The commission says if you ask that question, you're going to get hundreds of candidates on stage like John Smith of the Crustacean Liberation Party. This is ridiculous. The polling data shows that in the history of presidential debates, only 4 third-party or independent candidates would have met the criteria of simply meeting the wishes of the American people, of simply being supported by a majority of Americans to be in the debates. John B. Anderson, Ross Perot, you, Ralph Nader, and Pat Buchanan. That's not hundreds of candidates on stage. Those are totally valid and legitimate third-party voices that belonged on those stages. And third-party candidates face extraordinary hurdles to reach 15%. It's almost laughable. You have the most discriminatory ballot access laws in the world. You have scant media coverage. You have a winner-take-all system. You have millions of dollars in contributions that are being given to the major party nominees and not being given to third-party candidates. So if, despite all of these hurdles, a third-party candidate is able to persuade a majority of voters to let them participate in the presidential debates, what right does a private corporation created by the 2 parties, financed by Anheuser-Busch, have to tell the American people, no, you can't see a candidate you want to see? The other thing that I think is absurd about this criteria is that Congress gives parties that win 5% of the popular vote millions of dollars in taxpayer funds. They have put in a statute that if you get 5% of the popular vote in a general election, you constitute a minor party that deserves millions of dollars in taxpayer funds.
In the next round.
In the next round. Isn't it a bit ridiculous, Ralph, that a party can qualify to get millions of dollars in taxpayer funds and yet needs 3 times that amount of popular support, 15%, to be seen in the presidential debates? It doesn't really make any sense.
It gets worse. Listen to this, Steve, and the listeners. George, tell them who the pollsters are that determine whether you get 15% in the polls.
A lot of the pollsters are oftentimes pollsters affiliated with the Republican and Democratic parties. It's changed over the years, but the pollsters are often various polling companies that have contracts with the Republican and Democratic nominees who are internally measuring the viability of their particular candidates. So it's hard to know just how accurate the assessment is that the third-party candidates are even meeting the 15% threshold.
And they're also affiliated with like NBC or Wall Street Journal or Washington Post. So they work for the very media that is supposed to decide whether it's going to be a third party or independent candidates on the Commission on Presidential Debates sponsored debates. So it's a circular process. So the Commission on Presidential Debates and the 2 Republican and Democratic parties who control it, George, they wouldn't get very far without the cooperation of all the television networks, would they?
No, they wouldn't. The reality is that tomorrow the major networks could put on their own debate. They have a public service responsibility to use their publicly owned airwaves to serve the interest of the general public when it comes to elections. They could host their own debate. They can open that debate up to voices that the American people want to see on that debate, who have met ballot access standards, and the vast majority of Americans would prefer to actually hear from. And if the Republican Democratic nominees didn't show up, at least there would be on primetime television on the major networks an opportunity to hear from the third party or minor party campaigns. But the television networks don't take that step. They haven't done so in the past, and they're fine in allowing the commission to maintain a complete monopoly over this process.
It's even worse. In 1996, as you know, George, Ross Perot tried to buy an hour at a time of network TV time, the way he did in 1992 with all the charts and all, and showing, the other economic data for which he became quite famous. And he couldn't even buy an hour on NBC or ABC or CBS. And after the election, I called him up and I said, Ross, you're a billionaire. How does it feel being excluded by the networks when you're willing to put cash on the barrelhead and buy yourself an hour of time to get your views across to the American people because you were excluded from the debates? He said, I know. It's amazing. He said, the power they have, my checks don't bounce. And he still was excluded. So the media bears a very serious responsibility here. And as George Farah said, we're talking with George Farah now, the author of No Debate, How the Republican Democratic Party Secretly Controlled the Presidential Debates. It's the only book written on the presidential debates. He blew open the whole story in 2004 and got quite a bit of media. But before that, the American people were kept completely in the dark, and the candidates that they could have heard about or seen never got on the debate, so the voices and choices were restricted to the two parties. But people love to watch the debates. Isn't it right, George, that the size of the audience watching the presidential debates is only exceeded by the Super Bowl at the peak?
I mean, you cannot exaggerate the significance of these events. These are the only times that the American people have an opportunity to see the candidates outside of major 30-second soundbite television commercials financed by super PACs, outside of heavily scripted speeches at various venues across the country. This is the only time that we get a chance as the citizens to actually pose questions, to hear the candidates being forced to think on their feet in front of tens of millions of viewers. For such a sacred event to be controlled by an organization that so comfortably accedes to the wishes of the participants in that event is an outrage. I'm an antitrust lawyer. I fight monopolies and price fixers all the time. And to me, the Commission on Presidential Debates is an unlawful monopolist. Because to me, one of the most unattractive and anti-democratic provisions in the contracts that govern these presidential debates are statements by the candidates that say, we will not participate in any debate other than a debate sponsored by the Commission on Presidential Debates. It's just fundamentally anti-democratic, and it shrinks the number of debates that viewers get a chance to see. When Lincoln and Douglas had their debates, there were 7 debates. Each debate was 3 hours long. In the 2012 Republican primary, there were 27 debates. The more debates, the better. The more debates, we have a healthy understanding of the candidates who are running for the most important office in the world. But the commission is complicit in restricting the amount of debates that these major party nominees participate in, thereby shielding the candidates from ever making a significant gaffe in front of tens of millions of voters. So it's a real shame. This is the only chance we get to see the candidates theoretically forced to think on their feet, and they do whatever they can to avoid these episodes, and the commission does whatever they can to let them.
And George, tell the audience the size of the audience watching these debates, the peak size, and because of the tedium of the debates now and how predictable the questions are by the selected moderators and reporters selected by the two major parties, Republican and Democrat, how the debate audience has shrunken. But how high did it go? And you can see what I mean when I compare it with the Super Bowl.
There were, for some of the presidential debates, the audience viewership was in excess of 90 million viewers.
90 million viewers.
Wow.
Yeah.
How's that, Steve?
Pretty spectacular.
Yeah, that is Super Bowl numbers. George, I wanted to ask, as an antitrust lawyer, is there any way to go after the commission and break it up or eliminate it?
We've tried, by we, I mean my organization, Open Debates, which is the only nonprofit out there fighting the Commission on Presidential Debates and representing voices from across the political spectrum and doing so. The website, by the way, is opendebates.org, and we're fixing up the website as we speak. But we've tried 2 different tactics from a legal standpoint. First, we went through the FEC, the Federal Election Commission. The Federal Election Commission says corporations can give money to presidential debate sponsors so long as those sponsors do not endorse, support, or oppose political candidates. Well, we filed a complaint with the Federal Election Commission saying the Commission on Presidential Debates clearly opposes third-party voices and clearly supports the major party nominees. But the Federal Election Commission is a committee comprised of 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans, appointed by the president with consultation of the respective parties. So it's an inherently bipartisan organization. In fact, in 1997, Larry Noble, who was the general counsel of the Federal Election Commission, conducted an investigation after Ross Perot's exclusion and recommended that the Federal Election Commission pursue a full investigation and consider reforms. But he was voted down by the FEC because, again, their members are all Democrats and Republicans who have a vested interest in protecting the commission. Another route we tried was the IRS, arguing that the Commission on Presidential Debates is not an appropriate 501c3 tax-exempt organization because it engages in partisan activity. And again, we failed at that point. So the only successful avenue, Steve, is a political one. We created something called the Citizens Debate Commission that was comprised of 17 civic leaders from across the liberal and conservative spectrum. 60 civic groups backed us, 17 newspapers editorialized in support of the Citizens Debate Commission. We had actual venues selected for the candidates to show up, but they didn't show up. So it failed, in the short term at least, as an effort to try to displace the commission, because if no candidates from the major parties are going to show up, the press doesn't care and no one comes to watch. So the only real way to make this happen is to pressure the candidates, is to make the Republican and Democratic nominees commit to participating in genuinely democratic debates and make them pay a political price for answering the question no, saying no, we will not do so. Because any candidate in the United States running for president that is perceived as anti-democratic, that is perceived as openly excluding third-party voices, will pay a price in the polls. It's antithetical to the wishes of the vast majority of the American people, and it looks fundamentally scared and anti-democratic. So if we can put enough pressure on the candidates, we can prevail.
Especially if done in the primary level. During the primaries, they're more likely to say the right thing than when it's down to just 2 nominees, 1 Republican, 1 Democrat, right?
Absolutely. If you can get them to commit at the primary level where the candidates are desperate to win the nomination and are willing to make statements in the short term that make them look more attractive, we have a far better chance of getting them to agree. And a number of primary candidates actually agreed to participate in genuine, nonpartisan Democratic presidential debates. Unfortunately, none of those candidates ever got nominated to run in the general election. If I can point out one thing, Ralph, that we had some success recently in response also to Steve's question about what can be done. We managed in 2012 for the first time ever to persuade 3 of the sponsors, 3 of the financial and political backers of the Commission on Presidential Debates to withdraw their sponsorship. We exerted sufficient pressure in conjunction with other organizations, and 3 organizations, BBH, an advertising group, Philips Electronics, which sells, of course, electronic equipment, and the YWCA, all withdrew their support for the Commission on Presidential Debates, renounced their position as financial and political sponsors of the Commission as a result of our widespread criticism. So it's just a sign of what can be done if sufficient pressure is exerted. We can convince the corporate sponsors to pull out. We can convince the Republican Democratic nominees to participate in genuinely nonpartisan debates, and we can break this monopoly.
Listeners, if you want to know more details about what George has been talking about, go to his website, opendebates.org. There's nothing like it in the country, opendebates.org. And you also have had petitions and all kinds of feedback from voters to help organize them into a pressure group of the citizens in this country to really start affecting the early pre-primary type of campaigning by all these candidates who've thrown their hat in the ring for the Republican and soon-to-be Democratic nomination.
Yeah, one of the tactics we're hoping to do is to have some of our volunteers in various primary states ask the candidates on the record, are you willing to participate in debates that are not hosted by the Commission on Presidential Debates, but rather are in fact hosted by a genuinely nonpartisan organization that will have challenging formats and more democratic candidate selection criteria and operate more transparently. It'd be very difficult for those candidates to say no in response to that question. And if we can get them on the record, we can put some pressure on them if they ever become the nominee of either party.
Okay, a few weeks ago, the Commission on Presidential Debates announced its criteria and made other announcements about the upcoming presidential election. Can you tell the listeners more about that?
Sure. So the Commission on Presidential Debates said that yet again, it's going to be adopting the 15% criteria in the upcoming presidential debates, possibly That is to say that they also made a statement they haven't made before. And this is as a result of the criticism that we have made and other organizations have made of the commission. We've attacked them for the absence of transparency and for being fundamentally anti-democratic. So they're entertaining the possibility of listening to various citizens. So on April 1st of this year, they issued a statement saying that they're welcoming input from voters and civic groups about how to structure these debates, including the criteria used to determine who will be invited to the debate and what formats will be used. And they're going to listen to those various requests and proposed suggestions and respond. Now, Ralph, this is a very intelligent maneuver to deflect accusations that this is an insular organization, that it doesn't listen to the wishes of the voters, but it would be a shock to every bone in my body if, as a result of this allegedly deliberative process, the commission alters its candidate selection criteria in such a manner that makes it easier for third-party and independent voices to enter the presidential debates.
George, let me ask you, suppose listeners want to feed back their opinions to the Commission on Presidential Debates. Do they have a website? Who is the executive director? And who are some of the people on the commission, Democrat and Republican?
The commission has claimed that they're soon going to establish an online process for making submissions to the commission and having them review those submissions. As soon as that process is established, we'll post it on our website for your listeners to participate in that process. The website of the Commission on Presidential Debates is debates.org. The co-chairs are Frank Fahrenkopf, the former head of the Republican National Committee and the former president of the American Gaming Association until 2013, and Mike McCurry, the former press secretary of President Bill Clinton, the former director of communications for the Democratic National Committee, and now a lobbyist for the telecommunications industry. And the rest of the board members are a combination of individuals who are deeply loyal to the Republican and Democratic parties, and other individuals have been put on the board to give it a certain air of independence. They were recently added to the board after our book came out and after the attacks we've made to make the commission look less overtly partisan. But you've got folks like Leon Panetta, former head of the CIA and obviously a Democratic political operative. You've got folks like John Danforth, a former Republican senator. You've got folks like Alan Simpson, a former Republican senator, Olympia Snowe, a former Republican senator, Jane Harman, a former Democratic congresswoman. So it's full of, clearly, the majority of folks on the commission are individuals who have a deep affinity for the Republican Democratic parties, and when push comes to shove, are likely to make choices that serve the interests of their two parties rather than the interests of the public at large.
Well, the Commission on Presidential Debates is like an ironclad fortress funded by corporations, run by the two parties, excluding third-party and independent voices, reducing the choices of the American voter. So I like your idea of circumventing it, George, just the way you're proposing, where you have an alternative or an independent democratic process. You have a debate opportunity with accessible criteria and no corporate funding. And then you challenge the networks to say, look, you can't simply make more money off these Commission on Presidential Debates by doing only what the Presidential Debate Commission tells you can be done and not doing what the Presidential Commission doesn't want you to do. So it's important, folks, for you to feed back to the Commission on Presidential Debates. And the website is, again, George?
The website is opendebates.org. It's an organization that is designed to make sure that the debates reflect the wishes of the American people. If you just want 2 candidates in, then we'll 2 candidates in. You want 5 candidates in, 5 candidates in. But it's an organization that is truly nonpartisan, unlike the Commission on Presidential Debates, and its entire aspiration is to make our most important political events reflect the aspirations of what the American people want.
Yeah, well, just to make it clear, the Reform Group is the one that George Farah heads, and the website is opendebates.org. But if you want to criticize the commission directly, what's the commission's website, George?
Debates.org.
Yeah, debates.org. If I make a personal remark, in the 2000 campaign, when I was running for president on the Green Party ticket, I traveled to all 50 states. I talked to the largest paying audiences, filled Madison Square Garden, the Boston Garden, Target Center, all over the country. The Democratic Republican candidates didn't come close in terms of the size of those venues. And I figured out that even though I spoke to all those giant convention centers, I only reached 2% of the American people that I would have reached compared to my having been invited on one of those presidential debates. So you can campaign night and day all over the country before huge audiences. You don't come close to the size of the audience you can reach if you're on that stage with other candidates, including the Republican and Democratic candidates. How do they choose the reporters? How do they choose the moderators, George?
Well, for about, I think it's 4 different election cycles, the only individual moderator that was permitted to ask questions of these candidates who participated in the debates was Jim Lehrer. He was the only moderator that the Republican Democratic nominees would allow to ask them questions. So unlike the League of Women Voters that insisted on choosing aggressive and dynamic moderators like a Bill Moyers, the Commission on Presidential Debates in the past has allowed the candidates to exert veto power over who will ask them questions. And, Ralph, there have been other extraordinary manipulations of the format. For example, just take a look at the town hall debate. The town hall debate is celebrated as the one format where ordinary Americans who aren't journalists can stand up and ask questions of the candidates that affect them personally. In 1992 was the first time there was a town hall debate. It was Bill Clinton's idea. And people could ask whatever they wanted. The commission, thought, let's do this. If Bill Clinton wants this and George Bush is on board, let's do this. But during that debate, a person asked President Bush a difficult question about how the budget deficit affected him personally. Well, in the next election cycle in 1996, the candidates were scared of another question like that, so they banned follow-up questions in the town hall debate. And in the next election cycle in 2000, they required that every single member of the town hall audience write down their questions on index cards, submit them to Jim Lehrer in advance. Jim Lehrer then pre-screens the questions, throws out the ones he doesn't want, and picks who will ask the questions. In other words, people in the room are just props. Jim Lehrer is still asking all the questions. So it's a perfect example of the level of manipulation by the candidates. They did whatever they could to eliminate spontaneity that intimidated them and turned what was once an authentic town hall forum into really just a charade with a moderator asking all the questions.
We've been talking with George Farah, the author of the groundbreaking book, No Debate, How the Republican Democratic Party Secretly Controlled the Presidential Debates. He is a graduate of Princeton University, Harvard Law School. He single-handedly broke open this story. It's a commentary on the national press and the political press that they showed no curiosity in 1988, 1989, 1990, 1992, 1996, 2000, and who controls this Commission on Presidential Debates, how they exclude people, how they rig the system, and how they open up their wallets for contributions by corporate interests like Anheuser-Busch, the tobacco company, Ford Motor Company, and others. George, I think you want more people to contact you and say, when you start reaching millions of people on the media on this issue as it heats up, and members of the presidential primaries are asked questions about this, if not on the primary debates, they're asked on the hustings by informed Americans who go to your website, opendebates.org, and get the facts. But once you're on the media, you're going to want a lot of volunteers to circumvent the Commission on Presidential Debates, which may be engaging in PR to look good, but as you indicated, it's very unlikely they're going to change and open it up to more voices and choices for the American voter. So what do you suggest our listeners do if they are interested in volunteering wherever they are back home?
Please visit our website, opendebates.org, and you can email me directly at gfarah@opendebates.org. That's G, F as in Frank, A-R-A-H at opendebates.org, and we can together build a movement that tries to displace the Commission on Presidential Debates and break this monopoly that is hurting our democracy.
Before we conclude, Steve, do you have any questions?
Just a quick one. We know that the Republicans are going to have a series of debates with a whole raft of candidates. Do you think Hillary Clinton is going to debate Bernie Sanders?
That's a fascinating question. I think she'll have to participate in some debates. I think it's too expensive to look like she's avoiding debates. It depends how much pressure Senator Sanders exerts on Hillary Clinton. If he does what I expect him to do, which is to demand that she participate in debates, she's going to have to show up. When President Carter in 1980 refused to debate John Anderson, he paid a handsome price in the polls. It's very unattractive to voters to see candidates avoiding debates, running away from other voices. It makes them look timid, it makes them look tyrannical, it makes them look anti-democratic. So I think if Bernie Sanders puts sufficient pressure on Hillary Clinton, she's going to have to participate in primary debates with him.
I think George is right, because the Democratic National Committee announced a few days ago that there were going to be 6 Democratic primary debates. She can't escape that. Thank you very much, George Farah.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, George. We've been talking to George Farah, Executive Director of Open Debates and author of No Debate, How the Republican and Democratic Parties Secretly Control the Presidential Debates. For more information, go to opendebates.org. You're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Back after this.
Stand up. Oh, stand up. Rise up.
From Pacifica, you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
Oh, stand up.
Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan. David Feldman will be back with us next week. And I just want to say, we're not doing a listener question segment just yet, but I want to give a little plug for our show, because one of the questions that we get a lot on Ralph's Facebook page has to do with who are the next Ralph Naders? Who should we be looking to? And finally, I just want to give an answer to that question. And I would say, listen to the show. Tell people about the show, because we have all of these people on the show. People like Walter Hang, David Helvard, Lori Wallach, Lois Gibbs, Ray Rogers, Steve Schafferman, Ramar Sutton, J. Robert Hunter, Phil Matera, Francis Crowe, Ken Reed, Greg Leroy, Edgar Kahn, Robert Weissman. These are all the people that have either been inspired by Ralph, or Ralph is Johnny Appleseeded, or some of them just did it all on their own initiative. So anybody who's asking that question, who are the next Ralph Naders, listen to the show, because we bring them on to you. And on that note, we're going to speak to another person who I'm very excited to introduce here. William Blum is an author, historian, and freelance journalist. Disenchanted with a U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, Mr. Blum left his position at the State Department to found the Washington Free Press, the first alternative newspaper in the capital. He is the author of 5 books on American foreign policy, including the internationally acclaimed Killing Hope, U.S. Military and CIA Interventions Since World War II, which was first published in 1995 and updated since. No less an eminence than Noam Chomsky called it, quote, far and away the best book on the topic, unquote. His regular blog and his website, williamblum.org, is called The Anti-Empire Report. Very honored to have him here today. Welcome, William Blum.
Hi, thank you very much.
William, thank you very much for being on the show. It should be known that the Encyclopedia of American Coup d'etats in Other Countries is the book Killing Hope, U.S. Military and CIA Intervention Since World War II, meticulously documented, naming one overthrow of government after another by U.S. interventions. William, why did you write this book, and what was the reception by the mainstream press?
Well, I was influenced by Vietnam, as many other people were. And I was curious to see how many other Vietnams there had been in American history. And I began with the thought that maybe I'd find about 10 or 12, and I soon realized that there were many, many more, close to 100, I'd say by now. As far as how the book was received by the mainstream media, well, they used their favorite weapon for such books. They ignored it. That's what they do with books that don't make them happy. And I think all of my books have gotten one review in a mainstream media. The Denver Post did a review of one of my books. That's it. So I've had to exist in the alternative world. That's fine. I have a good audience.
Well, have they ever tried, either the people you've criticized, the agencies in government you've criticized, or what's often called these days neocon warmongers, have they ever tried to challenge your facts, which are truly meticulous? You spent a lot of time in the Library of Congress, and you named, who did what against what country's leader. Have they ever systematically tried to challenge your facts?
No. I wrote that book, the first version of it, in England. I was living in London and was first published in London. And there it had some reviews in the mainstream press. The London Times reviewed it and the London Review of Books. One review in London was by a member of Parliament, and he wasn't happy with the book. And to show how stupid a book it was in his mind, he quoted a long paragraph from my book And he thought it was so obviously stupid, there was no need to explain why it was stupid. But it was happened to be a paragraph I was quite pleased with, and he just left it as it is. So even those people have not shown or attempted to show any factual errors in my books.
What is it about a political culture, William, where people who deceive, who lie, who engage in cover-ups for foreign wars of aggression by the United States, like the invasion of Iraq in March 2003 by Bush and Cheney, they get massive publicity, massive attention, and people will come along and actually prove that they lied, they covered up, they deceived. Saddam did not have weapons of mass destruction. They stopped the UN inspectors who were about to complete their task. On and on and on. And they almost get no coverage. People like Noam Chomsky, Howard Zinn, yourself, it's like if you describe reality, the facts on the ground, the documents that certify the truth, what is it about American political culture that marginalizes people like that and highlights the people who engage in deception and fraud and embroil our country and its soldiers and the military families and the taxpayers in these brutal incursions and invasions abroad that are just leading to more and more boomerangs as the American empire after World War II expanded. So now we have military bases, I think, in over 100 countries. I've always been curious about what happens to a political culture or a society that repeatedly submerges attention to realities, what the government actually did, and highlights the excuses and the phony rationalizations for what they did?
I think the answer is very simple. They're embarrassed. What people like me expose is so contrary to what they've been raised to believe since childhood, what they have worshipped and admired so much about their God-given America, that they're embarrassed and that they don't want to deal with such information. So either they ignore it, which is the more common reaction, or if they're forced to comment about it, they'll be very negative about it. But they don't challenge the facts of people like me because they can't. They just are very embarrassed, and that's, to me, the entire answer.
Can you, William, give some examples of coup d'etats that you describe in your book? Just sort of briefly, 4, 5, 6 countries and governments that we've overthrown?
Well, I'll choose a few which are not so well known. I mean, we all know about Iraq and Guatemala and so on, but how many Americans know that the CIA overthrew the government of Australia in 1975?
Australia?
Yes, Australia. Listen to this one.
Yeah, because he was very much against the war in Vietnam, which was going on at that time. And it's complicated. You have to read the chapter, but the CIA overthrew him.
This was Prime Minister Gough Whitlam.
Exactly. Not with force, but through legal, unquote, means. And then there's Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana in 1966, who was acting very impudent. He was not accepting the role of the American empire in Africa, and he was influencing other African leaders along the same lines, and he was overthrown. And then there's Costa Rica. The leader of Costa Rica, Figueres, twice tried to overthrow him, once in the 60s and once in the 70s. He was being too hospitable to communists, in his government and so on, and that was his crime.
Of course, there's Iran.
Iran in 1953, you're right, that's very well known. We also attempted to assassinate Charles de Gaulle in the 1960s, and that's a complicated story. You have to read that chapter. And we overthrew the government of Uruguay in 1970 because they were then too hospitable to the left.
Weren't we supportive of the coup in Brazil in the 1960s? It turns out there were U.S. naval vessels off the shore. Well, what about that one? That was a big overthrow.
All right, 1964 in Brazil. And that led to a vicious dictatorship for about 20 or so years. people of Brazil suffered from a very horrible dictatorship thanks to the U.S.
These were all elected governments, too. The people elected the Prime Minister of Iran, Mossadegh, and the U.S. overthrew him, installed the regime of the Shah, which brutalized Iran for 27 years. And the Iranians don't forget that today.
Right. Most of the governments we overthrew the war had been elected democratically. I've compiled some other lists to summarize these things. And turns out, since 1945, the U.S. has attempted to overthrow more than 50 governments. We've interfered seriously in about 30 elections. We have attempted to assassinate more than 50 foreign leaders. We have bombed more than 30 countries, and so on. I have more items on this list. That's an eye-opener, I think, for most Americans.
And Patrick Sloyan, who just came out with a groundbreaking book, The Politics of Deception, on President Kennedy's involvement in Vietnam and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Wasn't there a connection between Washington and the overthrow of the premier of South Vietnam in the 60s? Can you explain that?
They probably were involved in his assassination. Remind me of his name?
Diem.
Diem. Yeah. They probably were involved in his assassination, and he was replaced by somebody more compatible with Washington.
You know, it is true that the American people get a very one-sided story about all these incursions and attacks and overthrow. They're all supposedly to defend our country from communism or threats to the oil flow to the United States or challenges to multinational corporations like United Fruit in Central America and other corporations in South America.
Or to fight terrorism, of course.
Yeah, and now, of course, to fight terrorism by increasing more of it. Al-Qaeda and its offshoots are all over the Islamic world. That's what we've gotten for our trillions of dollars and the loss of injury of tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers, quite apart from the slaughter and death of natives, innocent people in those countries from Iraq to Afghanistan. But how do you explain those Americans who aren't skeptical and aren't opposed to these incursions? Why did they go along with these politicians? Well,
that's a question I myself wondered about for years as I was writing my books and doing my research. It finally occurred to me what it is. These Americans have a basic belief which you have to deal with, and that basic belief is that our government, no matter how bad it may look, they do mean well. Their intentions are honorable, if not noble. And as long as a person has this deep-seated belief, whether it's conscious or unconscious, this belief that the government means well in its dealings with foreign nations, as long as they believe that, if you attempt to change their mind, it's like talking to a brick wall. So I say this to people who are activists who in the anti-war movement or in foreign policy. You must deal or attempt to deal with that basic belief. You must attack the idea that we mean well. My writing is often based on that premise. I give the information to activists to use to challenge this belief. That's what my books are composed of.
We've been talking with William Blum, who used to work at the State Department and who's written several groundbreaking encyclopedic detailed books about U.S. military and foreign policy abroad. One of his most popular ones is called Killing Hope, U.S. Military and CIA Interventions Since World War II, published by Common Courage Press in Maine. Tell them briefly, as we conclude, William, about your anti-empire report and how often it comes out and how they can get a copy.
Yes. I put out a monthly internet newsletter called the Anti-Empire Report. You just send me an email and asking me to put you on my mailing list. Or you can go to my website, William Blum, that's BLUM.org, and sign up for the report there. And you can read all the back issues of it on that website.
All free?
All free, yes.
You are a public citizen, for sure. Thank you very much, William Blum. And the website again is williamblum.org. You'll see a lot of light and a lot of truth and a lot of facts. Thank you, William Blum.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mr. Blum. We've been speaking with William Blum, author of Killing Hope, U.S. Military and CIA Intervention Since World War II, from Common Courage Press. Go to williamblum.org for his blog, The Anti-Empire Report. This is the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. We'll be back faster than you can say, stand up, rise up.
Stand up. Oh, step up.
The Ralph Nader Radio Hour is a weekly series where we get to discuss with Ralph Nader what's happening in Washington.
What's happening around the world, and most importantly, what's underneath it all.
Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan along with Ralph. And guess what, folks? We got to it. It's time to get some of your Facebook questions. Our first question comes from Andy Schuler. He says, Dear Ralph, are you familiar with the more holistic economic measurement called the Genuine Progress Indicator? And do you support its establishment as a supplement or replacement for the gross domestic product, which he says fails to take externalities into account?
There's been quite a good amount of work done on this, Andy, by progressive economists, people like Herman Daly and others. They've actually developed an index. There's an article that appeared a number of years ago in the Atlantic Monthly called Redefining Progress by Jonathan Rowe and colleagues, R-O-W-E. And the point is really quite simple. Whoever controls the yardsticks of measuring economic progress controls the agenda. So if you have business economists who basically are represented, say, by the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and he goes up to Congress and testifies for the Joint Economic Committee, and he says the state of the economy is good, nobody says, well, what about child poverty? Well, what about volunteers? Well, what about homemakers who raise children? Don't they have economic value, but they're not cranked in? On the other hand, if polluters create more disease, which creates more demand for pharmaceuticals, operations, other treatments, that increases sales and profits of hospitals and doctor practices and drug companies, and that increases the gross national product. So it's an extremely powerful controlling yardstick, the GDP, and we've got to replace it with a much broader series of yardsticks that measure levels of justice or injustice growing, levels of poverty or non-poverty growing, and of course measuring the value of the huge volunteer section of our society, starting with homemakers. Glad you raised the point.
Very good question, Andy. Thank you. This one comes from Sunny Young, and she asked, why are people not more concerned with the, quote, right wings being so casual about shutting down government? Why are people not concerned that these people who are running like Cruz don't want government and that it's bad, they don't want government that's buying for the people? They seem to be in some endless dream where they imagine themselves as the victors of the holy war.
Actually, politicians who want to shut down government in Congress pay a price. Bill Clinton was helped in his reelection in 1996 after Newt Gingrich, Speaker of the House, shut down the federal government for a number of days by not appropriating money to pay federal employees. So there is a feeling, and it's a majority feeling around the country, that the two parties may battle it out, they may shout at each other, but don't start suspending critical public and defense and welfare services and highways and national parks. Do not shut Uncle Sam down. So there is a political price to pay, and the Republicans sensed that over a year ago when some of their yahoos wanted to do that in the House of Representatives, but other Republicans held them back.
Thank you, Sonny. Mike Alberton writes, did CEO Jeff Smizek of United Airlines ever respond to the 2 letters you wrote him?
He hasn't responded yet. It was about the way he's mistreating 2,500 United Airlines employees, some of them 20, 30-year veterans loyal to the company, working the airports and the tarmacs, and he wants to have them put their jobs up for auction to be faced by outsourced companies to replace them with less experienced, lower-paid workers. The reason why he's demanding this now is because the union contract is up for these people, and he wants to save $2.5 million at the same time that last year he spent $350 million buying back stock to facilitate the compensation packages for himself and top United Airlines executives. So what I've done a few days ago is I sent my 2 letters to Smisek to the members of the board of directors of United Airlines. That's the next step. And I said, if you're not a rubber stamp board of directors, you should look into this. And then we're going to appeal to the U.S. Department of Labor as well as members of Congress. So keep up the heat, UAL employees. You're fighting for your livelihoods, dignity, and the safety of airline passengers.
That's great. We have time, I think, for one more question, and this one is a very relatable one for a lot of people. This comes from Marianne Fogel, and she asks, what can be done about skyrocketing rents? I will soon lose my apartment due to rapacious corporations who think shelter is a luxury, desperate for answers.
Well, that's true. And New York City has rent control. If they didn't have rent control, middle-class people couldn't live in Manhattan. Washington, D.C. has a weak form of rent control. Rent control can be a solution if it's done smartly, or it can be too draconian and dry up the expansion of the housing supply with new construction for apartments. So there's a middle ground, but it's a real crisis when gentrification takes over a whole area of a city and drives out working people to who knows where, and the landlords can do whatever they want. They are heavily tax subsidized. The tax code is very friendly to landlords and owners of real property, and we need that kind of rent control. We also need an expansion of housing policy to go along with it.
Well, good luck to Marianne. We've come to the end of another Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I want to thank you all for all those great questions. Keep them coming. We've run out of time. And I also want to thank our guests today, George Farah of Open Debates and William Blum of the Anti-Empire Report. On behalf of David Feldman, I'm Steve Scrovan. I'll talk to you next week, Ralph.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, listeners. Spread the word. Get the program on more radio stations.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long. Thieves in the temple, too much money changing hands. It's really very simple. Just make a list of demands. We demand freedom. We demand equality. We demand justice. It ain't gonna happen until folks like you and me just stand up.